Well, as promised, David Ashford is staying with us for part 2 of our interview. Now, this is really about questions. Excuse me, I'm going to use my glasses for this. David, thank you for staying with us. I mean, you're getting how many letters a day yourself personally? I mean, it must be quite a lot, isn't it?
Well, email-wise, I'm getting roughly around about 200 250 emails a day. Call-wise, at the moment, I'm probably averaging around about 40 calls a day. So the odd bit. You may have
probably got some of these, and I'm sure you won't be able to give too much on some, and others hopefully maybe just an insight. The actual numbers of individual people tested rather than numbers of tests, please. Why is there such a huge discrepancy between people tested and the number of tests?
So I'm not quite sure where someone's coming from in terms of the discrepancy there, because the number of tests is generally the number of individuals. There might be a small number of people who've been double swabbed, but it's a very, very small number of people. So the number of tests undertaken is normally is pretty close to the number of individuals that have been tested.
And part 2, this was on this particular day, of the 335 positive cases, how many required any hospital treatment, and what was the average stay, and how many in total have been in the ITCU care?
So the ICU in total, through ICU, I think off the top of my head we've had 6 people through ICU in total. In terms of the total number through the hospital, I haven't got that to hand. I would imagine in terms of the total number through the hospital, it's around about 40 or so that have been through. The average stay in hospital is normally around about 2 to 3 weeks.
Okay. Returning to the hospital here, the press conference is about the physics returning to work, and they've stated with hands-on at the hospital but are being given no guidance. I hope we're getting this. They mentioned non-essential healthcare was to be considered at the time of non-essential retail, but it seems to have gone away at the minute.
Right, so I assume this is a question around when we're going to start reactivating the clinics, etc., which I referred to briefly in the first part. Hopefully I can start making announcements this week. But again, I do need to emphasise it's got to be done in a phased manner. So it's not going to go straight from something being shut to something being open. And we've got to remember that a lot of the health services require other services to operate. And so they've got to be turned on as well and able to cope with demand of those services. Outside of the hospital, which is something I think the question might be getting at as well, things like chiropractors, physios, I assume, is also what the question's getting at.
That might be in the word, yes.
Hopefully I'll be able to make announcements around that this week as well.
Okay. What help does the government have in the pipeline for businesses closed by law? Paying our staff will not keep us operating in the long term. We need assistance with other overheads too. And by the way, thank him for the excellent work he's doing. So,
I mean, obviously we understand there's an awful lot of businesses that are under pressure at the moment, particularly in the hospitality industry and tourism, obviously, with the closure of the borders. I know Treasury is constantly looking at the schemes that are available and along with the Department for Enterprise. But unfortunately, as the Treasury Minister made absolutely clear at the start of this, the Isle of Man government won't be in a position to basically bail out everyone. There is going to have to be hard choices made, and there is going to be struggles for some businesses, and like I say, particularly those around restaurants and also pubs and clubs, etc., and the tourist industry that potentially is still going to be closed for a period to come. But as things do start to open up, things like non-essential retail and so on, more and more businesses, I don't want to say go back to normal because it's not normal, but can continue to start operating again. But from the health point of view, there are certain industries that unfortunately we will still have to keep closed for a period of time.
How much does the Abbotswood takeover, or the whole incident, I suppose, cost taxpayers in total, and who will be paying this bill?
So in terms of the Abbotswood takeover, it's the department going in from its registration and inspections powers. We won't know the full bill to be honest, until everyone's been rehomed, because of course there's still costs being incurred by people being in Newlands, being in the private patients unit. So at the moment we won't have that cost. That cost I'm sure will be a public cost once we actually know what the final figure is. But it was important that DHSC did step in and use their powers in the way that they have.
Since testing on the island, the amount of confirmed cases has dropped vastly. This is bringing confidence to testing. Is it being done correctly, or has it to be reviewed in the UK?
Right, no, testing is done correctly. If the testing lab wasn't working, we wouldn't be getting any positive cases. The way a PCR test works is obviously it's a swab test. So it takes samples from the back of the throat, from the nostril cavity for quite a way up, and if the virus is present, a PCR test will identify it. If the testing centre wasn't working, I see this going round and round in circles on social media, we wouldn't be identifying anything with the way a PCR test works. We ran, I think I've mentioned this before at one of the press conferences, when we set up our centre, we did what was called double testing. So we sent a sample of the test to Manchester, and we processed a sample on the island as well. And the verification, so it was a verification process to check we got the same results, and in 100% of cases we got the same result back.
Parents have been seeing things on TV about children contacting this disease that potentially has come about with contact with a person who has the virus. She has a 3 and 4 year old who was happy to go back, but now she's worried, should they be put back into a place where there could be exposure?
Well, the scientific community is actually very divided on this topic when it comes to children. The one thing they are starting to coalesce around now is the fact that children aren't super spreaders, because when this virus first emerged, when COVID-19 first emerged, there was you might remember the newspaper stories about children being super spreaders of this disease. The evidence now seems to show that not only do children get low-level symptoms, they don't tend to pass it on to people as much either. But there is still a lot of division in the scientific community around, if children, for instance, Switzerland's based their schools going back on the fact that they think children don't really pass it on at all. That's widely disputed, but there is now more and more consensus around the fact children get less symptoms than adults, and they're less likely to spread as well. For instance, there was the case of the boy in France, again an example from France, where he had contracted it. He was tested because of someone else he'd been in contact with, found positive, and when they did the trace back, he'd been in contact, because he'd moved around 3 schools in that time, he'd been in contact with 172 individuals, and not one of those 172 individuals actually went on to develop COVID-19. But that is a very extreme example, but certainly there is some evidence emerging now that children aren't as infectious as potentially we adults are. But like I say, I've got to emphasise again, the scientific community is still very, very split on that.
The government has said everyone must return to work. I'm assuming this is government workers by the 25th of May, and that's fine. But what about childcare? It's a massive issue because the schools are shut and only key worker children are going to be able to keep using them. Therefore, you're forcing people back to work and they can't get childcare.
Well, certainly in relation to government workers, I don't think that is the case. Maybe it's one particular section of government, but certainly, for instance, the office staff in my area in DHSC, most of them are working from home and will continue to work from home way past the 25th. So without the specific example, if in fact it's actually not referring to government and it's referring publicly to the statements that have been made, the one thing we've got to make absolutely clear is that government is not forcing anyone to return to work. We are allowing those particular industries, such as non-essential retail from the 18th, and some people in the office environment to return to work. So we're not basically preventing them from going to work, but equally we're not forcing them to. That's a decision for the individual businesses.
Does the medical evidence and expert advice support all schools to be reopened at this current time?
As I said, the medical advice is divided.
Yeah.
With schools will have to change the way they operate. The Minister for Education has already said that. There will need to be some social distancing measures put in place. And it probably will be a long time before things return properly to normal. But, education is working on a solution, because we've got to balance again the medical situation with the social need. And we've got to remember, at this current time, there are a lot of children who are not receiving their education, and the long-term effects of that can be just as damaging as anything else.
On a sports note, when can a person play golf with two balls? Is that part of golf? Is it? With people from different households, anyway, as they can now do in the UK.
Yeah, I was expecting this to come up, actually, Paul. I've had a few queries around this. We keep the advice constantly under review. We've been looking at what the golf associations have been doing in the UK and the guidance issued. We are constantly reviewing, and there'll be further announcements around sports in general very, very shortly. But at the moment, I'm not going to put an absolute date on it. But we do look at what other jurisdictions are doing and how they are practicing safely. And one of the things the UK has been able to do is the two ball.
Yeah. I mean, golf does seem one of those things where you can keep your distance, although I don't play it clearly, but anyway. This is about comas at hotel, and this is what the person's saying. The Ireland government's being charged or paying, is it £10,000 a week, plus they get £895 a head when it's being used, I guess. And at the time of writing, there were only 4 inmates, they put here. Is that acceptable value for taxpayers, given they could be tested and self-isolated at home with monitoring?
Well, the first thing to say is, with the changes we've brought in, people don't have to use the comas anymore. So there's not the need for the security, for the fencing, everything else that went with quarantine. People are using it basically as a hotel to self-isolate now. It is not quarantine. People are able to go to other premises as well, as long as they are approved by the department. So the situation has changed. At the point we did quarantine, yes, that was required. Because we needed, we've had to do things in a very managed basis. I know it's been very divisive, with some people supportive of the quarantine stance, others not. But at that time, it was the right thing to do for the protection of the island. And the other thing I should say is about the testing. Yeah. A test is not a guarantee that you don't have the disease. As we know, if people are tested early in the incubation period, then basically they can return a negative test but still actually have the virus and then go on to develop it. That's why even if you have a negative test, you still have to self-isolate for 14 days, just to make absolutely sure. But equally, there is the risk of you going back into another household. If you're going into a household that is already occupied, then you risk spreading the virus to that household and increasing the caseload number. Now, the question has come up before, well, if that's the case, why, when people in the general community, when they develop COVID-19, why don't they get told to self-isolate somewhere else? Well, the answer to that is because they've already been in that household. So in the event they are going to spread it, they've already spread it into that household. Whereas returning people haven't already been in that household to do so. I
understand. Any consideration given to people returning to work part-time? You can only earn £10 if you're on the dole, and £50 kills the Myra dead. This is incredibly tight.
So in terms of the people returning part-time, I mean, that's something that would need to be raised with Treasury, with the schemes. I'm not aware of the exact figures of how it trails off there, but that seems a bit of a steep decline there. That figure.
Right. How about comparisons with Guernsey? We sort of talked about this, who have been looking at elimination, with the benefits that could offer for a much wider reboot of local businesses and a continued border closure. What was the rationale for not following that ambition?
Because it's not just an ambition, being perfectly frank, it's not achievable. The only way you could even go for an elimination strategy is basically you shut everyone down for 21 days in their own home to flush the virus out. You then shut the borders to everything. So that means no one comes in. Key workers, including medical consultants, etc., don't come into the island. But at some point, you've got to release that. You can't stay shut down forever, and there's always a risk that you will then get more cases. The only form of eradication is a vaccine, and I hate to say it, that any jurisdiction, personally, I would say on a personal level, that's trying to go for eradication, they will fail.
We'll probably only do one more. I appreciate your time. I've got loads, but we can do it another time. Uni students changing accommodation will be leaving the island in August. There needs to be a travel plan in place for them, and also for parents of freshers who need to transport students plus belongings in September and then return to the island without involving, or will it involve still having to be isolation?
Well, I'd love to have a crystal ball to be able to say what the situation will be in August. Unfortunately, I can't. What I would say, though, is although calendar-wise, August seems to be coming around very quickly in terms of the way our response is developing for this virus, it's still an age away. Things are changing every single week. We are acutely aware, and the Department of Education is acutely aware of that coming up in August, September, assuming UK universities are in a position to open by then, because that hasn't been 100% confirmed yet by the Education Secretary in the UK, Gavin Williamson. But if they are, then obviously we would have to look at ways to try and facilitate around that. But all of our decisions are constantly reviewed and constantly changed. You know, people who watch the press conferences will see we're making announcements week in, week out. If you go back even to where we were 3 weeks ago, it's a very radical picture compared to where we are now.
And here's one which involves us in the press conferences. It's changing from next week. We're going to have Pool A and Pool B. Pool A is on Monday and Friday. Pool B is Wednesday and Thursday. Tuesday won't have one because Tim Walden, it runs late and the weekends are being dropped for some time. Why has this come about? And I'm asking that. I do know in a sense because we were involved in that negotiation, but why?
I think the thinking behind it. I wasn't involved in the negotiations, Paul. So you're probably even better to answer the question. You'll be able to tell me the answer.
People think there's too many questions. There's 9 people there sometimes. I
was what I was going to say was you're up. I think it's 8 or 9 journalists when you do the full thing. So it was felt that by splitting it, then we give people more opportunity. In the sense that you can then go for supplementary questions as well, I believe. Hopefully you'll acknowledge I've always been pretty good on the press conferences that if you've got an additional question on top of the supposed 2 you're allowed, I'll always, assuming I can see you waving from the screen, I'll always try and take the additional questions. So we think it's just a much more streamlined format, I would assume, is the reason why. And
I sort of touched on the other one, but do you actually enjoy this part of it? I mean, because you have to think on your feet. You have lots of pieces of paper there, and I've got to give you props on this one. You do this and you find the answer normally. Is it quite tough?
I have a lot of notes with me. I tend to try and anticipate, not always successfully, where you guys are likely to go. I do like the press conferences because I think they're exceptionally important because it's a chance for the media to have direct scrutiny of what's happening. You're good at throwing us curveballs on occasions where, despite the mounds of paper I've got with me, you manage to come up with something I've not got in front of me, which I do like. But I think it's exceptionally important, but also it gets the message direct out to the public as well. And I think it's quite important that the public hear the message firsthand rather than just through headlines or something like that. I think that's quite important that we do communicate direct. And like I say, the scrutiny element from the press is very important to be done as well at a time like this. And
it's great that we get so many questions, and we'll probably do this again hopefully with you because we've got lots more to talk about. But it's fascinating that people and in the Isle of Man they get the chance to put questions, albeit through us at the moment, but I think there's going to be talk about taking more questions from the public in the future, and you do the radio phone-ins, of course, as well.
Yeah, certainly from my point of view, I'm trying to get out as much as possible to give people input. I've done several of the Manx Radio Manning Lines. I've been doing the Manx Radio Breakfast Show as well. Obviously, we're doing this interview today, and I'm sure it won't be the last one we'll do, Paul. We'll make it quite a regular occasion. I think it is important that we do get out there. We won't always have all the answers to hand because there is so many different facets of things flowing off this virus. Obviously, I've been concentrating very much on the health side. There's also the business support schemes and everything else that goes with this, which I haven't got the huge amount of detail on because I've been so concentrating on the health side. But I think it is important that we are seen out there answering questions where we can. and and explaining to the public why we're taking the steps we are. And I think it's worked because the general public, and certainly the feedback I've had from people, is that they're feeling more reassured, but also they understand why they need to social distance, why they need to do things. And I just want to say a big thank you to all of the general public, because to everyone in our own community, because this has been an exceptionally hard couple of months, and everyone really has risen to the challenge. I think we're going to come out of this as a much closer community than we went into it.